10 Hollywood stars who faked their own death. For decades, Hollywood has captivated America with tales of glamour, scandal, and tragedy. But what if the greatest performances weren't on the silver screen at all, but in the carefully choreographed deaths of some of entertainment's biggest stars? The official stories seem straightforward enough. Heart attacks, overdoses, plane crashes, case closed. But for millions of dedicated fans across generations, something about these high-profile departures never quite added up. The evidence was right there for anyone willing to look beyond the headlines. Revealed a former FBI agent who specialized in celebrity cases throughout the 1970s and 80s. Some of these deaths had more holes than a Bemovie script. And when you've been in law enforcement as long as I was, you develop a nose for when something doesn't smell right. What most people don't realize is that several of Hollywood's most beloved figures left behind bizarre clues that suggest their deaths were elaborately staged disappearing acts. Mysterious last-minute changes to travel plans, wills modified days before passing, and perhaps most telling, bodies cremated with unusual haste before proper identification could be established. But nothing compares to the shocking revelation from a retired Las Vegas mortician who claims he was paid $50,000 to falsify death documents for one of America's most iconic performers. "I've kept this secret for over 40 years, he confessed in a rare interview before his retirement. But I can tell you with absolute certainty that the body in that casket wasn't who the world thinks it was. The motivation behind these vanishing acts. For some, it was crushing debt that threatened to destroy everything they'd built. For others, dangerous knowledge that made them targets of powerful enemies. And for a select few, the simple human desire to escape the suffocating pressure of fame that had transformed their lives into gilded prisons. Today, we're peeling back the curtain on Hollywood's most persistent mysteries. The 10 legendary stars who may have orchestrated their own disappearances in what could be the greatest performances of their careers. But first, let's start with the king himself, whose alleged death in 1977 launched the most enduring alive and well theory in entertainment history. And a mountain of evidence suggesting Elvis Presley may still be walking among us, hiding in plain sight. Elvis Presley, the king's greatest disappearing act. On August 16, 1977, the world received news that seemed impossible. Elvis Presley, the undisputed king of rock and roll, had been found unresponsive in his bathroom at Graceland. At just 42 years old, the official cause was a heart attack, likely related to prescription drug use. The music stopped, America mourned, and Elvis was laid to rest at his beloved Memphis estate. That should have been the end of the story, but for millions of dedicated fans, it was just the beginning of one of entertainment's most enduring mysteries. When you examine the circumstances surrounding Elvis's supposed death, the inconsistencies are startling, explained a Memphis-based journalist who has investigated the case for over 3 decades. We're not talking about vague theories or wishful thinking. We're talking about documented irregularities that would raise red flags in any standard death investigation. Let's start with the most basic question. Who exactly identified Elvis's body? Remarkably, this critical task wasn't performed by medical professionals, but by his father, Vernon Presley, who was devastated by grief and heavily sedated at the time. No fingerprints were taken. No dental records were checked. The man who revolutionized American music was allegedly whisked from this world with less formal identification than you'd need to cash a check. Then there's the matter of the death certificate itself, which contains a puzzling detail that Elvis fans have fixated on for decades, that Elvis's middle name was spelled Aaron on his tombstone, while throughout his life he spelled it Aaron. Was this a simple error or a deliberate signal from the king that something wasn't quite right? Elvis was meticulous about details like that, noted a former Graceland employee who worked closely with the singer during his final years. The idea that he wouldn't have caught that mistake on something as permanent as a tombstone just doesn't align with the man I knew. And remember, this was a man who was fascinated with disguises, aliases, and reinventing himself. That fascination with aliases becomes particularly significant when we consider what happened the day after Elvis's reported death. According to airport records that were later discovered, a man using the name John Burroughs, an alias Elvis had used for years when traveling, purchased a one-way ticket to Buenos Aires, Argentina, paying in cash and leaving no forwarding information. The timing is simply too perfect to be coincidence, insisted the investigative journalist. Less than 24 hours after Elvis supposedly dies, his known alias is used for international travel to a country that was at that time a popular destination for Americans looking to disappear. If this were a movie plot, critics would call it too on the nose. But perhaps the most compelling element of the Elvis mystery centers around his alleged work with the federal government, specifically the Drug Enforcement Administration. Multiple sources have confirmed that Elvis had been serving as an unofficial consultant to the DEA, using his celebrity access to gather intelligence on drug trafficking operations that had infiltrated the entertainment industry. Elvis had become valuable to federal law enforcement, revealed a retired DEA agent who requested anonymity. But that same cooperation had put him in danger. There were serious people, organized crime figures with connections to the music industry, who had learned about his role. By 1977, the situation had become untenable. The threats were credible and frightening. This scenario forms a backbone of what became known as the Elvis Witness Protection Theory, the idea that federal authorities helped Elvis stage his death to escape threats from organized crime figures who had discovered his cooperation with law enforcement. Supporting this theory is a peculiar matter of Elvis's sudden weight gain in his final years. While typically attributed to poor diet and prescription drug abuse, some investigators believe it may have been partially intentional, an effort to change his appearance sufficiently to make a transition to a new identity more plausible. When you're as recognizable as Elvis was, you need more than just a fake ID to disappear, explained the former FBI agent. You need to fundamentally alter your physical appearance. The weight gain, the growing out of sideburns in his final months, these could have been steps in preparing for a new identity. In the decades since Elvis's alleged death, the sightings have never stopped. From Michigan to Missouri, from Burger Kings to remote gas stations, people continue to report encounters with men who bear an uncanny resemblance to an aged Elvis. While most can be dismissed as honest mistakes or celebrity lookalikes, the sheer volume and consistency of these sightings has kept the mystery alive. I'm not saying Elvis is alive, the journalist concluded. I'm saying the official story of his death contains too many unexplained elements to be accepted without question, and in the absence of definitive answers, the possibility that a king orchestrated his greatest disappearing act remains one of entertainment's most fascinating unsolved mysteries. While Elvis's case represents the most famous of these disappearance theories, our next subject's alleged death seemed tailor-made to generate similar speculation. A performer whose entire career was built in blurring the line between reality and illusion, and to this Castellan. Andy Kaufman, the ultimate performance artist's final act. When Andy Kaufman died of lung cancer on May 16, 1984 at the age of 35, even his closest friends weren't entirely convinced it wasn't just another elaborate hoax. After all, this was the same performer who had built his career on a foundation of planned deception, audience manipulation, and a deliberate blurring of where the act ended and reality began. With any other celebrity, death would be accepted as a final word, observed a comedy writer who worked with Kaufman during his rise to fame. But Andy spent years conditioning his audience to question everything about him. He didn't just break the fourth wall. He convinced you there wasn't a wall to begin with. Unlike most entertainers who strive for audience approval, Kaufman seemed to delight in creating uncomfortable, confusing experiences for his viewers. From reading The Great Gatsby in its entirety on stage to his wrestling career that outraged fans, Kaufman approached performance as a form of elaborate psychological experiment rather than conventional entertainment. Most tellingly, Kaufman had repeatedly discussed faking his death with friends and associates as the ultimate expression of his unique approach to performance art. He even specified that if he were to do it, he would return exactly 20 years later. It wasn't just idle talk, insisted a close friend who knew Kaufman during his final years. Andy had detailed plans. He talked about the mechanics of how you would pull something like that off, the death certificates, the convincing of family members, the creation of a new identity. He was fascinated by the concept, not just as a stunt, but as the ultimate commentary on celebrity culture and the public's relationship with famous people. What makes Kaufman's case particularly intriguing is how secretive he was about his illness. While the official record states he was diagnosed with large cell carcinoma, an aggressive form of lung cancer, This diagnosis wasn't made public until the very end of his life. Even many who worked closely with him were shocked by the announcement of his illness and subsequent death. That level of secrecy made perfect sense if he was actually ill, noted the writer, but it also created the perfect conditions for staging a disappearance. When you keep your real condition private, you control the narrative completely. No one can contradict your version of events because no one else has first-hand knowledge of what's really happening. The conspiracy theories around Kaufman's death might have gradually faded if not for a remarkable incident at the 2013 Andy Kaufman Award ceremony. During the event, a young woman came forward claiming to be Kaufman's daughter, born after his death. She told the stunned audience that Andy was alive and well, watching from home, but not yet ready to make his public return. While this particular incident was later revealed to be a hoax, primarily orchestrated by Kaufman's brother, Michael, himself, perhaps hoping to channel Andy's spirit of performance. It reignited interest in the possibility that the comedian's death had been his greatest character yet. The hoax within a hoax is exactly the kind of layered deception Andy would have appreciated. The friend reflected. Even if he really did die in 1984, had created such an atmosphere of doubt and questioning around his public persona that his legacy includes this permanent question mark. In a way, he achieved immortality not just through his work, but through the lingering question of whether he's still out there watching the world debate his existence. Adding fuel to the conspiracy theories is the fact that Kaufman's death certificate was allegedly signed by a doctor who wasn't even on call at a hospital that day. And some insist the standard autopsy procedures for a 35-year-old with an unusual cancer diagnosis weren't fully followed. Do I personally believe Andy Kaufman faked his death? I'm honestly not sure, concluded the writer, but I know that's exactly how he would want it. The lingering uncertainty is perhaps his greatest legacy. He made us question the very nature of truth and performance to the point where even death itself becomes just another act to analyze, questioned, and maybe even applauded. While Kaufman's case represents a fascinating intersection of art and conspiracy, our next subject's alleged death generated theories driven not by artistic intent, but by the dangerous world he chronicled in his revolutionary music. West Game. Tupac Shakur, the rapper who knew too much. September 13th, 1996. After attending a Mike Tyson boxing match in Las Vegas, Tupac Shakur was struck by 4 bullets in a drive-by shooting and died 6 days later from his injuries. At just 25 years old, one of rap music's most influential voices was silenced forever. Or was he? Tupac's death never made sense to those of us who knew him well, stated a music producer who worked closely with the rapper during his final years. Not the timing, not the circumstances, and certainly not the aftermath. There were too many loose ends, too many unanswered questions, and too many people with motivation to help him disappear. The theories surrounding Tupac's potential escape from death center around 3 key elements: his extensive preparation for a potential exit, the suspicious handling of his body after death, and a flood of posthumous music that has kept his career oddly active long after his supposed passing. Let's start with Tupac's mindset in 1996. In the months before his death, the rapper had become increasingly paranoid about threats to his life. He had survived a previous shooting in 1994, was serving a prison sentence related to sexual assault charges he vehemently denied, and was embroiled in a dangerous coastal rap rivalry that had escalated beyond music into actual violence. He talked constantly about needing an exit strategy, recalled the producer. He specifically mentioned faking his death as a way to escape not just his enemies, but the entire identity he had created for himself. He felt trapped by the Tupac persona and expressed a desire to start over with a clean slate. Most significantly, Tupac had adopted the stage name Machiavelli for what would be his final album released during his lifetime. The reference was to Niccolò Machiavelli, the Italian philosopher who had famously written about faking one's death to fool enemies. The album title, The Don Kill Illuminati, The 7-Day Theory, has fueled endless speculation about hidden meanings and clues. The Machiavelli connection wasn't subtle. It was deliberate foreshadowing, insisted producer. Tupac was well-read and strategic about his image. Nothing he did was accidental, especially not something as significant as adopting a new performing identity based on a philosopher known specifically for advocating fake deaths as a tactical move. Then there's what happened after the shooting. specifically the handling of Tupac's body. He was cremated the very next day after his death was announced with no public viewing and no funeral service. This unusually hasty cremation has long troubled those who question the official narrative. In any high-profile death, especially one with potential criminal implications, you would expect the body to be preserved for potential further investigation, noted a former law enforcement officer familiar with standard procedures. The speed with which cremation occurred effectively eliminated any possibility of independent verification or follow-up forensic work. That's highly unusual in a case like this. Equally puzzling is what happened after Tupac's supposed death. A veritable flood of previously unreleased music that continues to this day. While many artists leave behind unreleased material, the volume of Tupac's posthumous catalog is extraordinary, with over 10 albums released after his death, many containing what sound like references to events that occurred after 1996. The sheer volume of vault material has always raised questions, said a music historian who has studied Tupac's legacy. Either he was recording at a pace that would be nearly impossible given his other activities, or some off-this material was created after his reported death. There are vocal patterns and references in some tracks that don't align with pre-196 Tupac, lending credence to the theory that he continued recording from hiding. The most compelling aspect of the Tupac survival theory centers around a potential escape route: Cuba. Tupac's aunt, Assata Shakur, has lived in Cuba since 1984 after escaping from a New Jersey prison where she was serving a sentence for her alleged involvement in the murder of a state trooper. She was granted political asylum by Fidel Castro and has been there ever since. Cuba would have been the perfect refuge, explained the producer, a country with no extradition to the U.S., where his family already had established connections, and where African American could live relatively anonymously among a population that wouldn't immediately recognize him. If you were plotting an escape from American celebrity, you couldn't design a better destination. Adding to the intrigue is what's become known as the 7-day theory, a complex set of numerological coincidences surrounding Tupac's death. He was shot on September 7th and died on September 13th. 7 plus 6 is equal to 13. He was 25 years old. 2 plus 5 is equal to 7. His time of death was allegedly 4 p.m. 4 plus 0 plus 3 is equal to 7. Believers in the theory point to these recurring sevens as deliberate clues planted by Tupac himself. Was Tupac actually murdered in Las Vegas? The preponderance of evidence suggests yes, concluded the historian. But the suspicious circumstances surrounding his death, combined with his own statements about wanting to escape his identity, have created one of music's most enduring mysteries. And perhaps that ambiguity is exactly what he would have wanted: to leave the world guessing, forever questioning whether the official story was just another verse in a much longer song. While Tupac's alleged death occurred at the height of his fame, our next subject's mysterious passing came when she was caught between the glamour of Hollywood and the dangerous world of politics, a combination that some believe made her disappearance a matter of national security. The first man never said that. I'm usually told how happy I am. Marilyn Monroe, the starlet who knew too many secrets. In the early morning hours of August 5, 1962, Marilyn Monroe was found dead in her Brentwood home, naked and face down on her bed. The official cause: probable suicide by barbiturate overdose. The world's most famous sex symbol was gone at 36, leaving behind a legacy of iconic films, troubled relationships, and enduring mysteries. For most celebrities, even a tragic death eventually fades into established history. But Monroe's case has proven different, with persistent theories that her death wasn't a side at all, but an elaborate extraction operation designed to remove a woman who had become a liability to some of America's most powerful men. Marilyn's final months were a perfect storm of risk factors, explained a Hollywood historian who has studied Monroe's life extensively. She was involved with both President Kennedy and his brother Robert. She had access to nuclear secrets through her ex-husband, Arthur Miller, and she was increasingly unstable and indiscreet about what she knew. From a national security perspective, she represented a genuine concern. The most compelling survival theory suggests that rather than being murdered, another persistent theory, Monroe was secretly removed from public life, essentially extracted by government operatives, and placed in a controlled environment where she could no longer pose a threat to the Kennedys or reveal sensitive information she had learned through her relationships. The scenario isn't as far-fetched as it might initially sound, argued a former intelligence community member who has researched the case. There were established protocols for removing and containing individuals who presented national security risks without resorting to elimination. In the context of the Cold War, with Monroe's connections to both the Kennedy administration and Arthur Miller, who had been investigated for communist sympathies, she would have represented a significant vulnerability. Supporting this theory are inconsistencies in the timeline of Monroe's discovered death. Her body was found by her housekeeper and psychiatrist, but there are documented discrepancies about when they actually entered her room and when the police were called, gaps of several hours that have never been adequately explained. The official timeline simply doesn't add up, insisted the historian. There are blocks of time that remain unaccounted for, periods when the body was alone with individuals who had connections to both the Kennedy family and intelligence services. That window would have provided opportunity for substitution of a body double. This theory gained surprising support in 1964 when a patient at a Canadian psychiatric facility began insisting she was Marilyn Monroe. While initially dismissed as delusional, medical staff noted that the woman knew intimate details about Monroe's life and relationships that weren't public knowledge at the time. She remained institutionalized until her death in the late 1980s, never wavering from her claim of being the real Marilyn. There were actually several Marilyn sightings in private mental health facilities across Canada and Europe in the years following her death, noted the researcher. While most have been dismissed as mentally ill women with fixations on Monroe, a few cases included women with physical characteristics and knowledge that gave even skeptical medical professionals pause. The alleged body double scenario lines with another unusual aspect of Monroe's death: the condition of her body at discovery. According to the initial findings, Monroe's body showed significant lividity, the settling of blood after death on her back and sides. Yet, she was found face down, creating a medical impossibility. Blood cannot settle against gravity after death. This discrepancy suggests the body may have been moved or repositioned after death, explained a forensic specialist who has reviewed the available records. Combined with the gap in the timeline, it opens the possibility that what was found in that bedroom wasn't Marilyn Monroe at all, but someone positioned to create the appearance of her death. Perhaps the most practical argument for Monroe potentially surviving comes down to value. As an intelligence asset, willing or unwilling, she would have been worth far more alive and controlled than dead, particularly given the information she allegedly possessed about both the Kennedys and various classified matters she had been exposed to. From a purely operational standpoint, maintaining her in a controlled environment, whether a private medical facility or a protected residence, would have allowed ongoing assessment of what she knew and who she had spoken to. The intelligence veteran pointed out, elimination is final. Containment leaves options open, especially with someone who might have information you need to protect. Did Marilyn Monroe really die that August night, or was she secreted away to live out her days in anonymous seclusion? The definitive answer remains elusive, but a combination of timeline inconsistencies, powerful enemies, and a high-stakes political environment of the early 1960s has kept this theory alive for decades. What we know for certain is that the woman the world knew as Marilyn Monroe disappeared from public life in August 1962, concluded the historian. Whether that disappearance was permanent or simply the beginning of a hidden second act remains one of Hollywood's most enduring mysteries, and perhaps one of the Cold War's best-kept secrets. From a political extraction to a rock star's escape from fame, our next subject's mysterious circumstances continue to generate questions decades after his reported death. You know that it would be Jim Morrison, the Lizard King's Paris escape. On July 3, 1971, Jim Morrison was allegedly found dead in a bathtub in his Paris apartment by his girlfriend Pamela Courson. No autopsy was performed, not required by French law at the time, and the official cause was listed simply as heart failure. The charismatic frontman of the Doors was supposedly laid to rest in Paris's famous Père Lachaise cemetery, joining cultural icons like Oscar Wilde and Edith Piaf. But within days of the announcement, the first of many enduring conspiracy theories emerged. The Lizard King hadn't died at all, but had orchestrated an elaborate disappearance to escape his rock star persona and pursue a quieter life dedicated to his true passion, poetry. Morrison had been openly discussing faking his death for months. claimed a music producer who knew Morrison during his final year. He talked about it after shows, during recording sessions, sometimes even in interviews. If you read between the lines, he'd become increasingly frustrated with his image as a leather-clad rock god. He wanted to be taken seriously as a poet and writer, but felt trapped by the doors and the expectations of fans. This dissatisfaction with fame was well documented. Morrison had grown increasingly uncomfortable with the adulation of fans and the demands of performance. He had gained weight, grown a beard, and adopted a more subdued appearance in his final months. Changes that some interpret as preparation for assuming a new identity. Jim was methodically dismantling the Jim Morrison that everyone thought they knew, explained a biographer who has studied Morrison's life extensively. The physical changes, the move to Paris, the deliberate distance he was creating from a band, these weren't random developments. They were calculated steps toward a transition he had been planning for some time. The circumstances surrounding Morrison's alleged death contain several elements that have fueled speculation for decades. First, only Pamela Corson saw his body before it was placed in a sealed coffin, creating a single point of verification that has never been independently confirmed. Corson herself died of a drug overdose in 1974, taking whatever she knew to her grave. The limited witness situation is the foundation of most Morrison survival theories, noted the biographer. One person who was herself troubled and not always reliable serves as the sole confirmation that Jim Morrison was actually in that coffin. No family members viewed the body, no band members, no medical professionals beyond the doctor who signed the death certificate, just Pamela. Adding to the mystery is the unusual speed with which Morrison was buried. He allegedly died on July 3rd, but due to the weekend and a holiday, the death wasn't reported to American authorities until July 7th. He was then buried on July 7th in a simple ceremony with no family or band members present, a remarkably quick and private disposal for one of rock music's most iconic figures. The timeline simply doesn't make sense for a normal death and burial, insisted the producer. Everything happened too quickly, too privately, with too little verification. If you were designing a plan to fake a death, this is exactly how you do it. Minimize witnesses, expedite the burial, control the narrative through a single trusted person. Morrison's own father, a high-ranking Navy admiral, publicly questioned the circumstances of Hisson's death, stating in a 1980s interview that he had never seen a death certificate or any official confirmation beyond media reports. This unusual skepticism from an immediate family member has further fueled speculation that something beyond the official story might have occurred in Paris. Admiral Morrison wasn't some conspiracy theorist. The biographer pointed out he was a military man accustomed to chain of command and official documentation. The fact that even he expressed doubts about what actually happened speaks volumes about how unusual the handling of Jim's death really was. Perhaps most intriguing are the numerous reported sightings of Morrison in the years following his alleged death. From the sales to Oregon, people have reported encountering a man matching Morrison's appearance and mannerisms, often living under various names and pursuing literary interests rather than music. One of the most persistent rumors places Morrison in the Pacific Northwest, living as a rancher, and occasionally performing poetry at small local venues under an assumed name. Several residents of Oregon and Washington have described encounters with a bearded, heavy-set man whose voice and intensity reminded them of the former rock star. Of course, most of these sightings can be attributed to wishful thinking or confusion, acknowledged the biographer. But the consistency of certain details, his continued interest in poetry, his deliberate avoidance of attention, specific verbal tics that were characteristic of Morrison, give some of these accounts a credibility that's difficult to dismiss entirely. Did Jim Morrison really die in that Paris bathtub? Or did he execute the ultimate rockster disappearing act? The truth remains elusive, but the combination of his documented dissatisfaction with fame, the minimal verification of his death, and his own statements about wanting to escape his public persona have kept this particular theory alive for over 5 decades. If any rock star of that era had both the motivation and the intellectual capacity to orchestrate a convincing disappearance, it was Morrison, concluded the producer. He understood symbolism, narrative, and the power of myth, creating the ultimate rock legend, the death that might not be a death at all, would have appealed to his poetic sensibilities. It would have been his final, and perhaps greatest artistic statement. While Morrison's case centers around a potential escape from fame, our next subject's alleged survival revolves around a more practical question. Did a specific iconic figure really perish in a fiery crash? Or was a cinematic-style body swap employed to preserve a specific image? There are a lot of men who spent a lot of time developing rules, and James Dean, the heartthrob who couldn't bear to age. On September 30th, 1955, James Dean was reportedly killed when his Porsche 550 Spider collided with another vehicle at an intersection near Cholane, California. The 24-year-old actor had just completed filming Giant, his third major film, and was en route to a car racing event when the fatal crash occurred. The promising young star was pronounced dead on arrival at Paso Robles War Memorial Hospital. That's the official narrative, one that transformed Dean from a rising actor into an eternal symbol of youthful rebellion. But persistent rumors suggest Dean may have survived the crash, horribly disfigured but alive, and lived out his days in seclusion, while his pristine image remained frozen in time. The James Dean theory is different from most celebrity survival conspiracies, explained a film historian who has studied Dean's brief career and enduring legacy. It's not about Dean himself orchestrating a disappearance. Rather, it centers on the idea that others, specifically the studio, might have made the decision to declare him dead rather than allow his perfect image to be destroyed by disfigurement. According to this theory, Dean was indeed gravely injured in the crash, but survived with severe facial injuries and burns that would have made his return to the screen impossible. Rather than allow their promising young star to live as a disfigured shadow of his former self, potentially damaging the marketability of his completed films, studio executives allegedly created the narrative of his death while arranging for his long-term care in a private facility. Studio power in the 1950s was almost unlimited, noted the historian. They controlled the narrative around their stars completely, managing not just their professional lives, but their personal lives as well. The idea that a studio would make the calculated decision to preserve a valuable image through a false death isn't as far-fetched as it might initially sound. Supporting this theory are several unusual elements surrounding Dean's death and its aftermath. First, the handling of Dean's body after the crash contained some inconsistencies. Though officially pronounced dead on arrival at hospital, some reports indicate he was still breathing when first responders reached him at the crash site. The official death certificate is notably vague about the specific cause of death beyond the car accident itself. There's a gap in the documentation between the crash site and the hospital that has never been fully explained, claimed a researcher who has investigated the case for years. Different witnesses gave conflicting accounts of Dean's condition when he was pulled from the wreckage, and the hospital records are surprisingly sparse for such a high-profile death. Adding fuel to conspiracy theories are the so-called crash dummy rumors, claims that Dean was fascinated by accident recreation and had actually participated in, creating lifelike dummies for crash testing. This seemingly random detail becomes significant in the context of the theory that involves body substitution. The crash dummy connection probably isn't literal. Dean wasn't actually creating test dummies, the historian clarified, but speaks to a broader truth about Hollywood in that era. The industry had access to extremely skilled makeup artists, prop creators, and effects specialists who could create remarkably convincing human replicas for film purposes. Those same skills could theoretically have been employed to create the appearance of Dean's death if decision was made to preserve his marketable image. Perhaps the most compelling aspects of the Dean survival theory come from a series of alleged sightings in the decades following the crash. Several nurses and medical staff from facilities in California and later Canada have claimed they treated a severely disfigured patient who was eventually revealed to them as the supposedly deceased actor. One account from a nurse who worked at a private California sanitarium in the early 1960s described a patient with extensive facial scarring who was visited regularly by studio executives and was referred to by staff only by a code name. According to her testimony, she was told the truth about the patient's identity only when she was leaving the position by a doctor who had had too much to drink at her going-away party. These accounts could easily be dismissed as attention-seeking or confusion, acknowledged the researcher. But what makes some of them credible is the specific details they contain about Dean's personal habits, mannerisms, and background. Details that weren't widely known before the internet era and would have been difficult for a random person to invent convincingly. Did James Dean really die in that crash? Or did he live out his days as a hidden figure, while his unblemished image was marketed to generations of fans? The truth remains elusive. But the combination of studio power, incomplete documentation, and persistent first-hand accounts has kept this particular theory alive for decades. What's certain is that James Dean, the icon, the perfect embodiment of youthful rebellion frozen in time, was far more valuable to Hollywood than an aging, disfigured version could ever have been, concluded the historian. Whether by coincidence or design, his reported death created the perfect marketing narrative. The brilliant young star who would never grow old, never lose his appeal, and never disappoint his fans by becoming ordinary. In purely commercial terms, his death was the best career move possible. While the Dean theory revolves around image preservation, our next subject's alleged survival stems from more recent events and centers around financial and legal motivations that might drive a modern star to disappear. Something like that is very sad because it's all negative. It's wrong. I think that's life to one of Michael Jackson, the king of pop's great escape. On June 25, 2009, the world received shocking news. Michael Jackson, the undisputed king of pop, had died at his rented mansion in Los Angeles. The official cause was a cardiac arrest induced by acute propal and zolazepine intoxication, powerful sedatives administered by his personal physician, Conrad Murray, who was later convicted of involuntary manslaughter. At 50 years old, one of the most recognizable and successful entertainers in history was suddenly gone, leaving behind a complex legacy of musical brilliance, personal eccentricities, and troubling controversies. But almost immediately, a counter-narrative emerged, one suggesting that Jackson, facing crushing debt and the immense pressure of his upcomingness as a tour, had orchestrated an elaborate exit strategy to escape his increasingly unmanageable life. Michael's financial situation in 2009 was catastrophic, explained a former music industry executive who had knowledge of Jackson's business affairs. He was over $400 million in debt, leverage against his catalog rights, with creditors closing in from every direction. The This Is It tour represented his last chance to generate enough income to stave off complete financial collapse. But the pressure of performing 50 shows when his health was already compromised created an impossible situation. According to this perspective, Jackson found himself trapped between financial ruin if Hecken sealed the tour and potential physical collapse if he attempted to perform. This no-win scenario, combined with his long documented fascination with elaborately staged performances and visual trickery, allegedly led him to consider the ultimate illusion, a stage death that would allow him to escape both the crushing debt and the relentless public scrutiny that had defined his adult life. Michael had been studying fame and its consequences his entire life. Noted a biographer who has written extensively about Jackson. He'd watched what happened to Elvis, to Marilyn Monroe, to other icons destroyed by the demands of celebrity. He was acutely aware of how fame had warped his own existence. The idea that he might have designed an exit strategy isn't as implausible as it might sound for someone with his particular psychology and circumstances. The theory gained unexpected credibility when footage emerged, appearing to show a figure resembling Jackson jumping out of the back of the coroner's van that was transporting his body. While the video quality was poor and officials dismissed it as showing a coroner's assistant, the footage became a cornerstone of the Jackson survival narrative. That video raised legitimate questions, insisted the researcher, who has studied celebrity death conspiracies. The timing, the movement pattern, the physical proportions of the figure. They align with Jackson in ways that are difficult to dismiss. Combined with other irregularities in how his death was handled, it created a foundation for reasonable doubt about the official narrative. Those irregularities include what some consider an unusually limited autopsy, questions about the exact timeline between Jackson's collapse and the 911 call, and the fact that the death was initially reported by TMZ, a celebrity gossip outlet, before being confirmed by more traditional news sources, suggesting potential leaks or media management. Perhaps the most intriguing aspect of the Jackson theory centers around a television appearance that occurred months after his reported death. A burn victim named Dave, born David Rothenberg, appeared on Larry King Live to discuss his relationship with Jackson, who had supported him after he was intentionally set on fire by his father as a child. Many viewers were struck by Dave's speaking patterns, hand gestures, and certain facial features, leading to widespread speculation that this was actually Jackson himself in disguise. The Dave theory is compelling because it aligns with Jackson's documented interest in prosthetics and disguise. The biographer pointed out throughout his career, he had worked with the top makeup and effects artists in Hollywood, often using prosthetics in his videos and even, according to some sources, occasionally in public to move around unrecognized. He had both the resources and the knowledge to create a convincing alternate identity if motivated to do so. While skeptics note that Dave was a real person with a documented history long before Jackson's death, believers counter that the real Dave could have been compensated for the use of his identity, or that Jackson could have specifically chosen someone whose unusual appearance would make the disguise more convincing. What's not in dispute is Jackson's lifelong interest in mechanics of fame and the power of illusion, noted the music industry executive. From the moonwalk to the smooth criminal lean to the elaborated productions of his tours, Michael consistently demonstrated a fascination with creating moments where the audience questioned what was real and what was manufactured. A staged exit from public life would represent the ultimate expression of that artistic preoccupation. Did Michael Jackson really die in that Los Angeles mansion? Or did he execute an elaborate disappearing act worthy of the spectacular performances that defined his career? The definitive answer remains elusive, but the combination of financial pressure, documented interest in illusion, and certain unexplained elements surrounding his death have kept this theory alive among dedicated fans. Michael understood better than most the double-edged sword of fame, concluded the biographer. He had experienced its highest peaks and lowest valleys, often simultaneously. The idea that he might have finally decided to step off the stage entirely, to disappear, not just from the spotlight, but from existence itself in the public record, represents perhaps the ultimate act of self-determination for someone whose life had been controlled by others since childhood. While Jackson's alleged survival would be a recent phenomenon, our next subject's mysterious circumstances date back to the golden age of martial arts films and center around potential threats that might have driven a star to disappear. Bruce Lee, the Dragon's Disappearing Act. On July 20th, 1973, martial arts superstar Bruce Lee allegedly died in Hong Kong at the apartment of actress Betty Tinkby. The official cause was cerebral edema, brain swelling attributed to an allergic reaction to a headache medication. At just 32 years old, at the peak of his physical condition, and on the verge of unprecedented international stardom, with the pending release of Enter the Dragon, the man who had revolutionized martial arts cinema was suddenly gone. But within this seemingly straightforward tragedy lies several elements that have fueled persistent theories that Lee may have faked his death to escape mounting threats from organized crime figures who had targeted him for his refusal to cooperate with their control of the Hong Kong film industry. Bruce's relationship with the Hong Kong triads was complicated and increasingly dangerous, explained a film historian specializing in Asian cinema. As his star rose, he refused to pay the protection money that was standard in the industry. He wouldn't cast actors affiliated with certain triad groups. He was essentially challenging a power structure that had controlled Hong Kong entertainment for decades, and doing so as his international profile made him too visible for them to handle through their usual methods. According to this perspective, Lee found himself in an impossible situation by 1973. His principles prevented him from acquiescing to organized crime demands, but his visibility made him difficult for these groups to threaten or eliminate without significant repercussions. This stalemate allegedly led to considerations of a third option, a disappearance that would allow him to escape these pressures while preserving his legacy. What makes the Lee theory particularly compelling is the film he was working on when he supposedly died, noted the researcher. Game of Death literally features a plot point where Lee's character fakes his own death to escape the mafia. The parallels to the circumstances of his actual life at that time are difficult to dismiss as mere coincidence. Several unusual elements surrounding Lee's reported death have sustained these theories for decades. First is a location. He died not at home with his family, but at the apartment of an actress with whom he was allegedly having an affair, creating a scenario with limited witnesses and potential for manipulation of the timeline and circumstances. The private apartment setting meant very few people actually saw Bruce in his final hours. The historian pointed out this creates precisely the kind of controlled environment that will be necessary for staging convincing disappearance. Then there's the medical cause itself. Cerebral edema attributed to an allergic reaction to a common pain medication. This diagnosis has been questioned by medical professionals who note that such a severe reaction to this particular medication is extremely rare, especially in someone with Lee's physical conditioning and no prior history of such allergies. The medical explanation never fully satisfied experts, confirmed a physician who has studied Lee's case. While certainly possible, the specific reaction, as described, represents a statistical anomaly that has fueled legitimate questions. Combined with the limited autopsy and the quick cremation of his remains, it created a perfect storm for ongoing speculation. This quick cremation, unusual in Chinese tradition, which typically involves more elaborate funeral ceremonies, has been particularly cited by those who question the official narrative. Lee's body was cremated within days of his death, eliminating any possibility of future medical examination or verification. Perhaps the most intriguing aspect of the Lee theory centers around reported sightings. In the years following his alleged death, from the United States to various Asian countries, people have claimed encounters with men bearing striking resemblances to Lee, often living quiet lives far removed from martial arts or entertainment. One persistent account places Lee in Oregon, where a Chinese-American martial arts instructor who bore a remarkable resemblance to the star reportedly lived under an assumed name throughout the 1980s and 1990s. Students at his small private dojo noted his reluctance to be photographed and his cryptic comments about previous lives in Hong Kong. Most celebrity sightings can be easily dismissed as misidentification or deliberate impersonation, acknowledged the researcher. But what makes some of the Lee sightings more compelling is the reported demonstration of his unique martial art abilities and teaching methods. Specialized knowledge that would be difficult for a random lookalike to possess. Did Bruce Lee really die in that Hong Kong apartment? Or did he execute a disappearance worthy of the cinematic stories he brought to life? The definitive answer remains elusive, but the combination of triad threats, unusual medical circumstances, and the parallels to his final unfinished film have kept this theory alive among dedicated fans and researchers. What's certain is that Bruce understood better than most how to create a lasting legacy, concluded the historian. Whether by cosmic coincidence or careful design, his death at the peak of his powers, just before his greatest international success, ensured he would remain forever young, forever at his physical peak, and forever the undefeated dragon in the public imagination. In terms of cementing a legend, the timing couldn't have been more perfect. From martial arts to grunge music, our next subject's alleged survival revolves around a death that many have questioned from the moment it was announced. Kurt Cobain, the reluctant icon's escape plan. April 5, 1994. The body of Kurt Cobain, the reluctant voice of Generation X and frontman of the groundbreaking band Nirvana, was discovered in the greenhouse above the garage of his Seattle home. A shotgun lay across his body, and a suicide note was found nearby. The official cause of death, a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head. At 27, Cobain had joined the tragic 27 Club of musicians who died at that fateful age. But almost immediately, questions emerged about the circumstances of his death. Questions that continued to fuel theories that Cobain didn't die that day, but instead executed a carefully planned disappearance to escape the fame he had grown to despise. Kurt's hatred of celebrity wasn't an act. It was a defining struggle of his final years, stated a music journalist who covered the Seattle scene during Nirvana's rise. He found himself trapped in exactly the kind of commercial music machine he had always despised. By 1994, he was actively looking for an exit strategy from both the industry and the Kurt Cobain persona that had been created around him. Unlike many celebrity survival theories that emerge from fans' inability to accept a star's death, the Cobain theory has been driven by documented inconsistencies in the official account and by the musician's own statements about wanting to disappear from public life. In multiple interviews and private conversations, Kurt explicitly discussed walking away from everything, not just a band, but his entire public identity, recalled a sound engineer who worked with Nirvana,